Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandra Hudson. I'm so thrilled to be moderating this conversation with my august panelists. I have Daniel DiMartino to my left here. I have Marshall, how do I say your last name? Koslov to my right, and I have Casey Given also to my right. People I've known for many years now and who are incredibly thoughtful on many subjects, but particularly on our topic today of the role of a rising generation of voices in our media culture and in our public discourse. And I've come by my interest in this. Honestly, I have a book that just came out 3 weeks ago called The Soul of Civility: Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves. And I'm thrilled. It was published by St. Martin's Press, and I worked really hard to be able to position myself for a book deal. The first time that my book went to market, I was told that nobody wanted my book. I was not the person. This was not the time to talk about civility in public life. This was an era where people just wanted to give hell to the other side. This is what book editors said to me. And I'm really grateful to have been able to partner with Young Voices, an organization that Casey runs, to help build up bylines and media hits that gave attention to ideas that were more, not even centrist, just more human and less partisan. And so I'm grateful for that support, and that this is kind of where I wanted to start our conversation today. Given these really strong incentives on both the political left and right, or that are just media culture, rewards extremism. It rewards the hot take. It rewards those that are willing to just say the incendiary and the inflammatory, that which will go viral or get the hate clicks, or to affirm people's preconceived notions. It's kind of this timeless question of philosophy. Can you be a just person in an unjust world? Like, can you have good ideas and thoughtful ideas in a world and a media culture that values simplicity, like void of nuance, void of truth sometimes, that is just more about the incentives of, promoting the bottom line and promoting, eyeballs and clicks. So who wants to start with that? So tell us about Young Voices,
Sure.
Casey.
There we go. Hi, I'm Casey Given. I'm the Executive Director of Young Voices. Thank you so much, Lexi, for those kind words. Young Voices, we're a nonprofit talent agency. We help libertarian and conservative writers, 18 to 35, get into the media between op-eds, radio, TV, public speaking. It's a great honor to have two of our alumni here. Both Lexi and Daniel were in our programs. When it comes to media, to go straight into your question, I think it's a dark time for public discourse, but at the same time, it's never been easier for a young person to get their voice out there, for people to enter the public discourse, to enter the conversation. And I think that's really exciting. At Young Voices, we've had a lot of luck with that in terms of platforming young people, that even a 22-year-old straight out of college with a unique idea can get into places like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, as we've had some success with. I feel like a lot of people are pessimistic, saying that, people just, they only listen in their bubble, or they only have an attention span of 10 seconds. That's kind of a new thing with TikTok and whatnot. But at the same time, you've also seen a demand for more people, listening to long podcasts, like, the success of the Joe Rogan Experience or something like that, where there is also people who are looking to take deeper dives into conversations. And that gives me hope for things. And also another thing that gives me hope is really the power of storytelling. I think that's something particularly you're seeing much more demand for. And Young Voices, we actually have launched a project that was actually the brainchild of Daniel DiMartino here, called the Dissident Project, in which we platform immigrants to the U.S. who escaped tyrannical regimes like Venezuela, where Daniel's from, or Cuba, North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran, to tell their stories before high schools. And we've found a lot of success from that because storytelling does not come off as political discourse, does not come off as preaching, but rather people just instinctively are wired to put their defenses down and empathize with stories. And that's been a way, I think, that's very powerful in terms of breaking the mold and conveying the message of freedom. So I see a lot of reason for hope in the future.
I love that. So Aristotle has, in his conception of rhetoric, there are three mechanisms of persuasion. There's ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos is character. Who's the messenger? Are they a credible person who's talking? Logos is one thing that the right has traditionally been really good on. It's logic. It's reason. It's looking at the data. What does the data say? And I think that we're good at showing that the data is on our side in many policy debates. But then there's pathos, and that's related to the word passion, and that's emotion, and that I think is where we have an opportunity to grow. That's the realm of storytelling, and that's where I think that the Dissident Project is absolutely excelling. They're taking real life stories and sharing why the principles of a free and flourishing society are timeless and universal and needed now more than ever. So with that, tell us about the Dissident Project and your story, Daniel.
Yeah. Well, I'm Daniel DiMartino. I'm the founder of the Dissident Project. I'm a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And, I think that you're right in that the center-right movement has always been focused on the logos, but not as much on the pathos. And I think there's always a passion and an emotional angle to the issues that we talk about. And we've forgotten a lot about that. So when we talk about things like crime, we are like, we need to punish the criminal or we need to make our streets safer. But what about the story of the victim, right? That's the pathos angle to this. What about the stories of, against socialism? It's not just about, and the taxes are going to make us poorer. No, what about the Venezuelan refugees who are escaping through the bridge to Colombia? I was giving a talk at Wingate University, North Carolina this past week, and I always show the picture of the Simon Bolivar Bridge between Venezuela and Colombia, where there are thousands of people pouring over to Colombia. And in the Q&A, this girl raises up her hand, stands up, and she says, I crossed that bridge in 2019, and when I left Venezuela. All the other people in the audience were like, wow. It suddenly became personal. Somebody who was there was a witness. So we need more stories about in our side in order to persuade people. But now on the not as optimistic side, I think that that's a good path forward. But I think the situation we're in is a situation of where the left really wants to stop that from happening. And when I say stop it, is that, high schools who may not want to hear our stories maybe will use the school boards to not allow an event to happen. Or maybe, and I was talking with somebody before this event, how high schools are systemically underrepresenting conservative and libertarian voices in the libraries. There's, the top 35 high school districts in the United States, none have a Milton Friedman book in their library that is published. But almost all of them have the Communist Manifesto. So it's not a marketplace of ideas if you're not in the marketplace. And of course, we can do a lot. It's not necessarily, obviously, I think, state governments need to intervene in some way too, but it's also about, I think, conservative parents, conservative nonprofits who in the past forgot about this. We thought that, it was enough to just put our policy proposals out there, and it's not. We have to do things like the Dissident Project, where we're actively reaching out to schools to get there. But maybe parents and, maybe the students themselves through their parents need to be more active and volunteer. And let's gift these books to the schools. Let's reach out and give them these resources. There's always an ally. And so I think we need to be more proactive in civil society, with civility and all of that.
Thanks, Daniel. I think another challenge that conservatives, classical liberals, libertarians have is that we revere the past, and we have sort of a status quo bias. The famous story of Chesterton's fence. You don't just walk up and see a fence in the middle of the street and say, why, this has no purpose, let's tear it down. You say, why is this here? And find the story about why that fence was there in the first place. So I'd love to hear from you, Marshall. What are the challenges about this status quo bias, and how might we adapt? This is also the conservative tradition, adapt the best of the past, these time-tested principles that we care about, and meld them with the needs of the present.
Yeah, so Marshall Kozloff, I'm a fellow at the Hudson Institute and a fellow at the University of Texas. My politics are more centrist than conservative, so I think I'm in a good position to kind of understand the broader societal dynamics that are driving illiberalism on the right and the left and are causing a lot of these problems in the media ecosystem. So the first issue is that if we're looking at the prompt, why is freedom under threat here? I would say it's that freedom for a lot of folks, especially in Gen Z, has become associated with a status quo that I think most people disagree with. Everyone's unhappy in their own little way when it comes to American society today. So if you think about freedom, let's say you're unhappy with college education, you're probably going to think of your grandfather or your grandmother telling you, oh, why can't you just work a job this summer to pay for your college tuition? That's what we did, versus the fact that it's costs are unsustainably high today. So my biggest piece of advice when it comes to both the storytelling aspects of this freedom dynamic is to recognize that those who identify themselves in the freedom camp will be more successful if they're able to frame their approaches to public policy questions and issues as attacking a status quo rather than maintaining one. Because there's nothing particularly libertarian or conservative about the status quo in higher education. If you're the type of person who thinks that we need alternate models when it comes to apprenticeships or not just like the typical K through 12 path, there's nothing inherently status quo about that as well too. So as much as you can frame yourself that way differently, that's going to help. I want to speak at a broader level why I'm largely optimistic despite the poor media climate though. And I think it's largely because algorithmically driven media, which is kind of a little different than like the cable news hit discourse we'd had. So if we were doing this panel 10 years ago, we'd talk about, the big goal you have. I'm sure you've experienced this. Like the big goal that you could have had as like a 25-year-old and in 2012 is like, I want to get on Fox News or I want to get on CNN. Like I don't think that anyone who's acting in good faith has that as their objective. The real objective is YouTube. It's getting booked on big podcasts. Like it's really like behaving in those spaces. And in many ways, that's a bad thing because I think those spaces, because they're driven by the algorithm, are 100 times more toxic. There's real little top-down control. And there's a real need to be not just inflammatory in the cable news sense, but like darkly, dangerously inflammatory. The good news, though, is that we actually live in an era where there's a lot to be done. This is my point around like actually fixing the status quo. And when it comes to challenges we face, like the fact that per the second panel, we have issues with semiconductors, the fact that we have the issues we have with higher education, these angry, siloed off podcast, YouTube centric spaces are not actually capable of building anything positive. Therefore, there's actually a big opening to the left, the right, and the center when it comes to building alternate movements that actually speak to these issues. Because once again, if you're, I say this as a podcaster, the higher the numbers are on YouTube from you, the dumber the topic tends to be, which is just an unfortunate reality of our space. So like the degree to which programs like Young Voices and conferences like such as themselves can create spaces for people could actually think and build and put something forward facing, there's going to be a lot of runway to work with.
That's great. So thanks, Marshall. Part of my story is that I was in federal government. I was with Secretary DeVos at the United States Department of Education and experienced firsthand the profound division in our body politic, in our politics, in our country, in our world right now, at a macro and a micro level. I saw it and I experienced it personally, and I did not feel like I was being part of the solution in government, and felt like I desperately had to write a book. I had a book in me about our divisions and how we might heal it. And that was 5 years ago that I left government. I left in 2018. And I remember I sat down with a lot of really thoughtful people who are leaders in the center right kind of media culture right now. I sat down with David Brooks very shortly after I left government, and I said, what do I have to do to write a book? And he goes, well, if you want to write a book, you have to be on television. And he's like, you have to be on TV. If you want to be a thought leader, you have to be on TV. I sat down with Ben Dominick, one of the co-founders of the Federalist Society. He said the same thing. You want to, be a thought leader right now, you have to be on television. And I tried, and I've done some television, but I didn't like it. I still don't like television. I still, as I was then, it didn't work with like my thought process. It didn't work with I struggled trying to, I'm much more of like a long dinner party kind of style, or a podcast kind of like, let's have a long, like 2-hour conversation about this topic. And, I also there are many things I'm just not willing to do or say that will get me on television. And maybe people on our panel have this story of producers saying, you're willing to say this party line, I'll put you on television. and some people are willing to do that. And I haven't been. And it's hard. There are these incentives to have an opinion on absolutely everything that happens. And not just an opinion, but a novel opinion. This sort of like hot take culture. And that's really hard to resist. Even now that, my books come out, I feel that temptation. Like how do I insert, my book into every single thing in the news? And it's just exhausting and not productive use of my time. And I still struggle with that though. But I want to share or just get the thoughts of our panel about this, the problems, but also the opportunities with our current news cycle right now, or news media culture right now. For example, we're unbelievably disintermediated. There are very few gatekeepers anymore. Very few, not gatekeepers, kingmakers, king and queen makers anymore. Like one person who can just, snap their fingers and make a sensation out of a book or out of a thinker, out of a person. And on one hand, thoughtful people have reflected that that's bad. The fact that not everyone is going and getting their news from the same source is like bad for social cohesion. That we're not accepting the same narrative. We're not on the same page. We're not all consuming the same things every time. That's bad for social cohesion, bad for democracy. But there's also a lot of opportunities as well, like the fact that there are not, and Casey alluded to this in his remarks, that the fact that there are not, just a few, king and queen makers anymore. We have podcasts. Like it's funny. I was just thinking about this. Like, I think that for all their virtues, David Brooks and Ben Dominic, like, I don't think people our generation really watch television. I think it's like older generations that watch television, and millennials listen to podcasts. That's where they get their their commentary, their current events. And Gen Zers they go on TikTok. That's where they get their news, and on Instagram. And there we can find people. This disintermediated media culture, we can find people who we trust, and we can kind of cultivate our niche and get our information, our lens to the world that aligns with us. So what do you think? I would love to hear from you. What are the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of this disintermediated media culture? On one hand, I think it's good that it's not as centralized as it used to be. As Casey said, there is way more opportunities. Like anyone can start a blog, start a Substack, and begin writing about what they're passionate about and grow an audience that way. But it also, it's hard. It's really hard to kind of grow and get attention for things, especially if you're not willing to play the game that we've been talking about so far. So anyone of you want to take up that?
Sure. I think hindsight is I think people look at the past kind of with nostalgia, and I think a lot of to your point of like people saying, well, there's not really a coherent national narrative anymore, and looking with fondness to the days of Walter Cronkite and that's the way it is or whatnot. But really, I think there were negatives about those types of days in the past, and oddly enough, to use the leftist terminology, often with disinformation. And we see that even currently with the pandemic is a great example of where this was the government really putting out, this is the official narrative, and if you question this, you're a conspiracy theory. And then looking back years later, we're like, oh wow, actually, a lot of people who who questioned the official narrative about like the lab leak theory turned out to be right. And so I think it's a positive thing that we have kind of this expanded public square where people can, put out all different types of alternative angles to whatever the official narrative is, even if the downside of that is that sometimes there's a lot of kooks out there, and sometimes there can be little toxic niches of the internet. But I think in terms of what proactively it means for our movement to spread a positive message of freedom, I think one thing that we can do, and I say this also to be reflective of my organization too, is that so many groups are not really engaging in these new media. Like we talked about podcasts, but even TikTok, or I shouldn't even necessarily say TikTok. I should say Reels, because all of the platforms, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, are embracing this now. And a lot of think tanks, a lot of folks are just not doing it. At Young Voices, we could be doing a better job, or investing in influencers as well, investing in people just putting out short videos, spreading the message. That's really the way to get the youth. They're to the degree that I talk to groups who are doing this, or talk to people like Brad and Hannah at Base Politics is a great example. It's quite impressive how they're able to get so many millions of views. So I think that that's something to be reflective of our movement that we really need to invest more in. And I think also the pandemic was a great wake-up call for really investing in schools. Of course, we talked about the Dissident Project, but that's something, is to spread the storytelling and ideas and invest in being really reflective in our communities and engaged in our communities, as your book talks about, because we cannot just leave it to public speakers. We cannot leave it to our elected officials to raise our kids. We really need to invest in the civil society ourselves. And so I think that's actually a great positive thing about the new kind of media discourse, is that it makes people, it makes people, people are spreading information and being more reflective, and can really question official narrative. It's a good thing that we have a lot of information. We're just in the beginning of this experiment. David Bowie called it the alien of the internet that's invested. But I think that in the future, as we get to know how to grapple with information, it will be a positive thing for society.
Thank you, Casey. One thing that I talk about in my book that kind of resonates and echoes what you said, that we can't change the world, but we can change ourselves. And I talk about this idea of cultivating our digital garden in my book, that we can just choose, and this is what I've done with my publication and newsletter called Civic Renaissance, that it's a newsletter and publication dedicated to beauty, goodness, and truth, and reviving the wisdom of the past to help us lead better lives. That we can't control who's booking us and who's tweeting what, and who's trending on TikTok right now. But we can change ourselves. And I have cultivated my little corner of the internet that's 50,000 people strong that cares about these ideas. And that, I think, is one bright side of the disintermediation and the opportunity that a few people passionate about, or one person passionate about something can find an audience. There are people, and we're able to find people who care about things that we care about in this. That's a silver lining to our very digitally connected era that we're in. So that's like a thing of hope that I talk about in my book, and I do believe it, but at the same time, we really are all slaves to the algorithm. Does anyone here, do you guys subscribe to Connor Friedersdorf's Best of Journalism? Anyone here? No one? Well, you should. This is like the one subscription I pay for. Connor's a columnist at The Atlantic, and I love his newsletter where he reads the internet and gives really great, excellent long form journalism. And yes, there are no Walter Cronkites, but I've thought about canvassing Connor to create a reading club for people who read his links and talk about them, because I always read his links and they're all always great, and I always want people to talk about them with. And one of these articles I read, so I'm very much not a net consumer of stuff on the internet, but I do read Connor's links. It's pre-vetted, it's curated, it's always interesting, kind of outside the box stuff. And one of them from this past week was he'll add a gloss paraphrase of what the article's about, and it's read this article to understand the TikTok culture. So I read this article, and it was about this a Mexican immigrant who, his parents brought him here when he was very young, saying, we're going to Disneyland, and never went to Disneyland. He ended up in California for the rest of his life, and he never forgave his parents for that. But, he kind of clawed his way up and made a name for himself, like figuring out the mysteries of TikTok and Instagram's algorithms. And he created a media company, the name of which escapes me right now, that basically could identify, influencers with some talent or like a niche, some sort of following, and then they would take them and game the algorithm and then shop that to brands and say, look, like, give us this part. And this is like the very beginning of influencer management agencies. Like this is like, a decade or so ago, like the very beginning of this sort of thing that is becoming more and more standard, where, there are literary agents in the book publishing world, there are managers in the, world of Hollywood and cinema, and there are, social media managers for influencers who negotiate your brand deals for you. And there are two things I took away from that article. One was just the absolutely dispiriting life of an influencer. Like, it is grueling. It is like, it's so funny that our culture seems to valorize this way of life right now. Like, everyone wants to be, a TikTok star, but like, they have such pressure to put out new content every second of every day. You can't just have a life, a private moment. Like, everything everything's content. Everything's for the world to be consumed. And I just I just have empathy for that. Like some of the influencers interviewed in this article talked about how they would send, 3 folders, like terabytes of data every single day to their managers because it had to be scheduled like weeks and months in advance. And it's like, you're not just living your life anymore. It's like, it's all performative. And thoughtful people have talked about, the performative nature of social media. So anyway, I had so much empathy for I just felt that was so dispiriting. Like, this thing that is valorized in our culture is actually not all that fun. It takes a lot of the joy out of just enjoying something if you have to be, enjoying it in a certain way, knowing that it's going to be consumed by the world later. The second thing that I took away from this article was that we are all slaves to the algorithm, as I noted. And unless you have people in your corner who are studying the algorithm changes and what these tech gurus in Silicon Valley are doing every second of every day and adapting minute by minute and telling you how you do it, you should adapt minute by minute, you're going to create the greatest content in the world, and it's not going to fly. It doesn't matter. You're going to feel like you're shouting into the abyss. And I'm just curious what our panel, and we'll turn to questions in just a few minutes here, but curious what our panel thinks about that. Like, on one hand, we can cultivate our digital garden. We can do a lot to make the world better and more beautiful. On the other hand, we'll be voices in the wilderness if we don't get savvy about the algorithm. We are all slaves to the algo.
Well, just to build on that real quick, the big problem you have here, and you kind of heard this in some of the responses, is the metrics which we as organizations, individuals, institutions decide to preference ends up shaping the outcomes in ways I don't think we think too critically about. So when I came to DC in 2015 and I'm hearing about national review, or I'm hearing about like interning at AAI, and the whole point there, their articulation is, look, like, your job here isn't to write an airport book, because, an airport book, if a fellow wrote an airport book, that would sell the most books, but that wouldn't actually accomplish the mission of influencing public policy. You kind of hear the story about, in the Reagan administration, Heritage is able to write that like initial set of policies that really define the process. That way, that's the way the story's told. But when organizations start focusing on, it's so cool that we could launch these podcasts and we could get millions and millions of views, or we could find these influencers who can get millions and millions of views, I think there's a genuine lack of understanding of the value-driven endpoints that's going to lead you to. So, like, take an example, like the past few months, Israel, Gaza, Palestine. TPUSA has this big influencer marketing program where they have these influencers who have like TikToks, and they're on Twitter, they're sort of all over the place. And very quickly, a bunch of these kids have started just being deeply anti-Semitic, deeply anti-Israel, beyond just a good faith debate we can have about how Israel should respond to 10/7. That's driven by the fact that A, at a core level, from the second these kids entered into the movement, the core message they've been told is, you are here because views are what you deliver and views are what matter the most. Like, that is the main way that we assess value in addition to the public policy discourse. So because they're rooted both in views, when you see, as has been revealed in a bunch of studies, that like anti-Israel, anti-Semitic content does far better than pro-Israel content does, these influencers are going to go in that direction. People are saying, like, why is this TPUSA person just saying the Hamas party line? It's, well, because you said the goal was millions of views, they're going to act accordingly. So when these institutions who ignored podcasting for far too long, when they kind of jump into this space too late, they are going to have an urge to kind of overcompensate and lose what they're actually rooted in, which is, hey, public policy matters, ideas matter, missions matter, institutions matter. So I think given that context, I think there's a difficult but I think important needle thread here, which is we can think it's so cool that our organization could build a TikTok or build a Facebook page or get a YouTube channel. They could get millions of views. The question isn't that cannot be the goal. The goal has to be, how do we take advantage of this disintermediation while also retaining the mission-driven aspect of the work we're doing? Because I see most institutions failing along those lines.
I think that's an excellent point, right? Media is a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. But this makes me think a lot about, I speak to YAF students as well on college events through Young America's Foundation. And recently at my last event, which was with high school students in California, one girl asked me about haters and, like hate speech and all of that, because they feel very much attacked, right, in social media. And I think that's another big problem with the algorithm, right, that the negative, the bad things are the ones that are given attention. And because of the incentive structure, people say things that before they even form views, they just say it because they think it's cool. They think it's cool to be an influencer. And they're not formed yet philosophically, which is why I deeply care about the work I do with the Dissident Project and reaching high school students before college, because we want, obviously, to persuade people who are on the fence. Most it's not true that young people are all leftists, or most of them are. Young people are just, most of them, completely disengaged. Most young people don't vote. So really, it's about turnout and persuading them. So the question is, obviously, how do you persuade that segment of the population to believe in free enterprise, to believe in political freedom, also the left, but then how do you identify those kids who are going to become the good influencers of the future? And you need to obviously put those ideas in front of them. Their brains are already predisposed, their history is already predisposed for them to join in the cause, because maybe they came from a socialist country, or maybe because they came from a conservative family, or they were adopted and they feel very strongly about the pro-life issue and they just need to get connected to the conservative movement. So how do you identify those young people, prepare them so that they're principled, and then they use the media as a means to an end? Right? And that's why it's so important, the work that we're doing with college students, with high school students. And I'm afraid that a lot of organizations are instead, and you mentioned TPUSA, right? But, everything's about how I own the libs. And obviously that creates more engagement in the media, but it does not persuade people in person. And I think we need to do a lot more of the work of persuading people in person. I think we learned from the pandemic that in-person interaction is superior to online interaction. And if we are able to get in front of young people and have those debates, those discussions, it's so much more meaningful. I remember when this was also in North Carolina, but not this past trip. This was in the Burlington, North Carolina. And I went to a classroom, Spanish classroom, where this American teacher had a 6-foot-tall poster of Che Guevara in the classroom in North Carolina. And I just thought, wow, the indoctrination is so deep. But the teacher, thankfully, he didn't know what I was going to speak about, because he wouldn't have sent the kids otherwise. But he sent the kids to my talk, and I was able to debunk the whole thing about Che Guevara in front of the teacher to his own students. That's irreplaceable. You're not going to achieve that, anywhere else like that. And so I think we need a lot more of that in order to make freedom win among the rising generation.
So in conclusion, any foundation heads here support Young Voices and the Dissident Project. So we're going to turn to questions now, and we'd love to hear from you. I have something I want to say about cancel culture. So if cancel culture is anyone's mind, feel free to ask a question about that. But okay, yes.
So I don't have a question. I just want to say I work for perfect timing. Mariana Davidovich Foundation for Economic Education. I love what you're doing with the Dissident Project. Casey and I have spoken extensively. I've written a primer called The Buried Stories of Communism and Socialism, and I'm adding this project as a reference so teachers can reach out to you and hire you. And I'm working on getting you involved with fee potentially. Don't quote me on that one. Unfortunately, it's being recorded, I just noticed. No, I just wanted to also say, I'm from Ukraine. We were part of the Soviet Jewish exodus. And what's happening in the world today, there's nothing more important than this, in my opinion. And my mother is one of the speakers. She's one of the victims of communism, and she's spoken all over the place. A guy walked in with a Che Guevara shirt. She teaches gymnastics and strength and things like that. He walked in, and she looked at him, "Do you know what that shirt means?" And he's like, "Oh, it's cool. Get out of my class. You can come back after you've changed." And then when he came back, she gave him a lesson. So not really a question. I just want to commend your work. And yes, I support you fully.
Thank you so much. That's so kind.
Stand up, but hello. First of all, thank you guys so much for speaking. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Chicago, just moved to DC, and something that I've noticed in part of choosing my college journey. I grew up in the Bay Area, clearly more of a progressive bubble in terms of perspectives. Really wanted to get away from that, and I found that sort of community at the University of Chicago, which is obviously known for having a history in terms of promoting certain ideas of classical liberalism in its economics department and just freedom of thought and the life of the mind and all these other perspectives. So I guess I'm curious what you guys see in terms of what the future looks like on university campuses, kind of transitioning from the previous panel as well in the main room. When it comes to university campuses and even high schools, how does the exposure to ideas like classical liberalism and ideas that again don't even exist in high school libraries? I wouldn't have even gone to the University of Chicago. I'm now working at the Cato Institute. I wouldn't have even been exposed to these ideas had I not, been open to something that wasn't the status quo, again, coming from California. So I am curious where you see the most room for growth when it comes to exposing young, impressionable minds to classical liberalism beyond and ideas that fall center and center right. From an economic perspective as well when it comes to education.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start. I think it's a pretty dark time on campus. I think we can agree with that. In the main panel, the first question was about the whole Hamas-Israel situation and just how much apologetics there have been for terrorism on campus, frankly. And that's something at Young Voices we've actually had quite a lot of luck just in the past few weeks, bringing attention to the state of discourse on college campus. We've gotten things placed in the New York Post, several Fox News hits, and number of major media outlets, because people are waking up just to see how scary, how far left campus has gone on that. Institutionally, I'm also currently reading Greg Lukianoff's new book about cancel culture, which I think is really wonderful, and just kind of the state of discourse on college campuses seems even darker than I thought it would. But I think one area of hope I have is that I think the left has truly overplayed its hand, and I think people are starting to wake up to that. Not just, of course, us adults, but also you're starting to see this in polling with kids as well. One thing, some of you might have saw this news story, but high school senior boys are the highest rate of identifying as conservative in 3 or 4 decades. So there's there's certainly a backlash, I think, happening. Of course, Ovik mentioned in the opening session about capitalism and socialism are about 50-50 right now. But I think especially as parents wake up, especially as there's a lot more effort of teaching students, about the horrors of communism with not just the Dissident Project, but there's a lot of other great projects out there. I have hope for the future that eventually these trends will change, and that students will definitely, at the very least, be more questioning of teachers when they're trying to just jam, leftist propaganda down their throat. But I think hopefully in the long term we'll actually be much more cherishing the importance of freedom and the values that built this country.
You want to add to that, Marshall?
Oh, yes.
And I think and I understood how we got there, but I think it wasn't particularly helpful from basically pre-2014 onwards, that so much of like the campus culture and free speech debate got as right-wing coded as it was. So if you were someone, if it's 2019 and someone's talking about free speech and someone's talking about campus culture and campus climate, I would automatically assume, fairly or not, okay, this person's going to be center right to the right. And clearly, no matter where you're coming from on the political spectrum, something is just so clearly broken in higher ed. At an administrative level, at a university professor level, that we have a weird moment where for the next, I don't know, maybe year, maybe even shorter than that, anyone can engage on this topic and try to kind of fill that space, which means that there's actually some work that could be done in a helpful way. So you're not just going to just be some sort of right-wing rabble-rouser saying like, hey, wait, like we actually have like a culture of intolerance that's unable to like adjudicate complicated societal problems. So I think that's a point of excitement.
I'll say also quickly, I think we need to step up in the liberty movement we also need to staff colleges and we need to work at colleges. Why do you think this happened? Because which conservative do you know is, I want to be a college administrator, right? I'll tell you two very quick things that happened to me while I was a college student in Indiana, IUPUI, you may know it, close to Chicago. First thing they do in student orientation, a walk of privilege, right? To put CRT and gender theory in the minds of students immediately. Okay, men are have privilege over women, whites over blacks, Christians over non-Christians, everything. And then when I was in the student government, in the residence student government, and I wanted to organize, because we organized events for our residents. We had a Hanukkah event, we even had a Ramadan event, but when we wanted to have a Christmas event, you could not write the word Christmas on the flyer. And I know it sounds, oh, you're so petty. Who cares about the word Christmas? You know what? I do care about the word Christmas, because the holiday is Christmas. Because I'm happy to celebrate any holiday of any religious denomination, and I ask that respect too. And there is definitely bias and discrimination, and it is at the institutional level. And if conservatives don't fight back, and that, of course, if this is a state university, this is, of course, unconstitutional. But even in private universities, we need people to be willing to speak up, and a lot of students. So this is both, we need to staff the universities, and second, students also need to say, I don't care about my grades. I need to stand up and say what I believe. There's a lot of students who are afraid. Now, I'm not afraid because, I'm from Venezuela and I don't give a crap if you disagree with me. But, a lot of students are afraid because they don't want to get a bad grade. And I think we need to teach the kids, you have to be brave, because this is America and your grades are not as important as our freedoms.
That's great. We have time for probably one more question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this. So I'm from Mexico. I studied my bachelor's in Mexico. I did international relations. I had courses on economy, politics, never heard of liberty. What is that? The curriculum was basically socialism, Marxist authors. I didn't have any idea what I was reading. That was just so confusing. But in practice, I just knew that this doesn't make any sense. Then I did my master's in Europe, in England, and in the Netherlands, and the curriculum was similar. Never heard of Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, Ayn Rand, nothing. Until I was lucky enough to meet this guy. He became my friend, and he shared with me Milton Friedman books and Thomas Sowell, and that opened my eyes. But I think it was just luck. I was just lucky. I think that if it wasn't because of him, I would still be like believing in those ideas. So I think that at least here, you guys in America, you discuss ideas, and then you know that ideas matter. Because in countries such as Mexico, we don't even know what is that. We're just copying whatever is coming from America or Europe. So I think I agree with what you were saying with your comment. I think there is a crisis of independence. Kids are so, or people, not only kids, teenagers, people are so afraid to be independent because we are scared of thinking differently to others because we know how much hate we're going to get from them. So it is hard. It is hard to stand up for your own beliefs. I just have a
we're about
question.
out of time.
Oh, okay.
So there's no time for questions.
Sorry.
But maybe, yeah, it was great. It was great. Yes, yeah. So feel free to grab our esteemed panelists to talk with them after the conversation. I think we're ready for lunch. But so nice to be with all of you. Thanks for joining us for this session. And I think, just remember, cultivate your digital garden. We can't change the world, but you can change yourself. Change how you engage in the social media culture. That's what Daniel is doing with Dissident Project. That's what Casey is doing. That's what Marshall's doing with his excellent podcast. What's it called, Marshall, in case you want to check it out? Realignment. So everyone check out Marshall's Realignment podcast. And thank you all for being here. And I invite you all to join Civic Renaissance, my newsletter and publication. And if you dedicated to beauty, goodness, truth, and the wisdom of the past. And I'd love to thank all of you who choose to do so. I'd love to give you a copy of my audiobook that I recorded myself on Publication Week in New York. So if you'd like a copy of the audiobook of The Soul of Civility and would like to join Civic Renaissance, find me after this. But thank you guys so much for being here.